This is Viva Fry.
I'm Dr. Peter McCullough.
This is Tom Luongo.
This is Chuck Prodnick.
This is Alex Kreiner.
Hey, this is Brad Wall.
This is JP Sears.
Hi, this is Frank Peretti.
This is Tammy Peterson.
This is Danielle Smith.
This is James Lindsay.
Hey, this is Brett Kissel, and you're listening to the Shaun Newman Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast, folks. Happy Tuesday. Holy Dinah, has it been a bullet train of a few days. And before we get to all of that, and then some, did you know junk silver refers to old circulation coins like dimes, quarters, half dollars, and dollars from back before our government debased our money by removing the silver from our coinage? Many of these older coins are not only a solid investment, but also ideal for trade or barter if the economy ever truly went sideways under old King Carney. That might be possible. I don't know. Man, Carney, unbelievable. Well, I'm an optimist. I truly don't see us getting there. King Carney's making me question that. But I do understand and appreciate the sleep at night insurance policy that the coins provide. That's why I bought some. And Silver Gold Bull, they're my go-to for precious metals. And they have a feature on junk silver right now exclusively for you, the listener. Just text or email Grahame for details about this feature or any other questions you may have around buying, selling, storing, or using your retirement accounts to invest in precious metals. Profit River, SMP. Yeah, we've teamed up. And any purchase you make, I need you to reference the SNP. We got a primary contact. That's Joel. He is their phone and internet sales manager, and he knows his stuff. So we're going to bypass, the front desk lady. No offense to the front desk lady. And we're going to go to somebody with some expertise. And they've created an email address to get right to them. SNP@profitriver.com. It's down in the show notes. On any purchase you make, whether it's online, in person, over the phone, reference SNP. That'll get you entered into a $100 gift card that's going to be drawn each and every month. They're going to be tracking purchases, not like our government, a way of just, kind of challenged the SMP listener, if you would. And I said, challenge accepted. Let's do it. Let's find out how many gun owners are watching and listening to this show. So if you're looking to get, anything to do with firearms, optics, and accessories, make sure to reach out to Profit River. You can go on profitriver.com. They service all of Canada. And any purchase made, just reference SNP. That'll help put you on the list for a $100 gift card to Profit River. So once again, profitriver.com, folks. RecTech Power Products. For over the past 20 years, they've been committed to excellence in the power sports industry. And they got a whole lot of stuff going on throughout the next coming months. You can put your order in for a Skidoo for the fall. I never, I joke about it, but I'm like, obviously I'm not in that world because I'm like, right now, I'm talking about spring, baby. It's right there. I can almost feel it until it dropped to minus 15 the other day, and then I was like, oh, maybe not. It's getting closer. But RecTech, when it's coming to spring, they got you covered. Side-by-sides, man, has anybody walked by? Sorry, folks, to go all local. But when you go through the multiplex, they got the Defender there. The kids are just like in love with it. Let me tell you, that is a beautiful side-by-side. They also got, obviously, your Skidoos, your boats. Lund has been, the Cadillac of the fishing boat. They got Lunds now in Lloyd. And so if you're on the west side of Lloyd, stop into one of the border markers of Lloyd. Well, it's becoming a border marker through all of you. And check out their showroom. Tell Shariah and I sent you. And get them to show you some things. There is a whole lot going on. If you're online, just go to rectechpowerproducts.com. Planetcom. When you're growing your business, running your business, trying to stay on top of the ever-changing world of information technology can be overwhelming, to say the least. Well, I tell you what, even trying to stay on top of our politics can be overwhelming, to say the least. That's why they're here, and they're going to take care of you, leaving you to do your thing, and they can do theirs. For 22 years, Planetcom has been boosting your productivity by proactively managing every aspect of your IT infrastructure, both in-house and in the cloud, and ensuring you're not tangled up in technology, and you can just go and get some things done. All right? Planetcom.ca. You're building a website, Planetcom. That's where you got to go, planetcom.ca, and talk to Carl and his team. Substack, free to subscribe to. Obviously, you paid attention this week, and I put out a video going, week in review. You can wait another week because we're going to run a 4.5-hour live stream on on Carney's coronation. Well, you heard all that. All right. If you're listening, watching on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Rumble, X, make sure to retweet it, subscribe, leave a review, comment, all the things, share. We rely heavily on you fine folks to get the word out. All right? Let's get on to that tail of the tape. The first is an engineer and owner of Original Oil. The second, a freelance consultant who wrote accepted policies for the UCP, including killing e-tabulators, connecting Alberta to more ports, and anti-WEF policies. And the third, an independent writer, analyst, and author of Autopsy of a Pandemic in Grass-Fed Cattle. I'm talking about Dustin Newman, Peter Scholz, and Julius Ruechel. So buckle up. Here we go. Welcome to the Shaun Newman Podcast. Today I'm joined by Dustin Newman, Julius Ruechel, and Peter Scholz. I got to be honest, Peter and Julius, you guys got two last names that don't make any sense in my brain, but I still think I knocked it out of the park this morning. Welcome back, gentlemen. Thanks for hopping on this morning.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Great to be here, Shaun.
Okay, we're going to start with Peter. I for the audience, and as I was saying, for the three of you, I've never had you on together. Just a quick, 2-minute, background, if you will, Peter. We'll start with you. Feel free to just share some insights about who you are.
Thanks, Shaun. Great to be here. Nice to meet everyone here. I live near between Cochrane and Canmore, and I have 5 children, one of whom was ecstatic as I plowed my 500-meter driveway with his truck. And when he got home, he was like a little 2-year-old running around going, burr, burr, burr. He was on seventh heaven, so that's the high point. I'm a transportation planner and a regional planner by profession. I work independently with a variety of clients, mainly in Alberta. Professionally, the thing I'm most interested in is building corridors out of Alberta's north, east, and west to the north, more corridors to the north coast of BC, to Hudson Bay, and to Alaska and the north coast. I don't know what else to add from there.
I think that's perfect, Julius.
I come from an agricultural background and a geology degree, but I started writing about the COVID stuff back in the middle of the madness there, and that's kind of how I ended up getting involved in more and more of just speaking out about all the crazy different things that are going on and trying to make sense of it all. So that's kind of what I bring to the table.
Whereabouts are you chiming in from today?
We are back in interior British Columbia, North Okanagan. So,
Dust.
Dustin Newman, I'm Shaun's brother. I'm an engineer by trade. I run a small oil producing company at the moment near Lloydminster, Alberta. I was involved with the Wild Rose Independence Party in Alberta back during COVID because COVID scared the crap out of me. And that party completely dissolved. But my interest is generally in Alberta and returning to something that looks like growth and prosperity for the future. So
I'm going to start with probably the big news of a couple nights ago, which is Carney being coronated. I kind of joked about it with Peter when he first walked on. We've been talking about this for a couple months now. With Trudeau intending to resign, and now, and everybody going, oh, it's a foregone conclusion. And people like, well, maybe it's not a foregone conclusion, but everybody was like, no, he's going to be the next one. And that's, in fact, what happened. Your guys' thoughts just immediately on a new prime minister here in Canada, not going through the traditional route, but, by all things I can read, the legal route. I mean, this is one of the ways you can become prime minister in Canada, which is really sad to say, but hey, that's what it is. What are your thoughts on Carney? And I guess I should have started this out by saying we're in a roundtable format now, boys, so don't feel like you have to bring it back to me every time.
The empire strikes back is what we're seeing. The WEF has lost power of the United States, and they are rapidly regrouping, and Canada is a primary target. Because we're right next door to the U.S. They want to piss off the Americans strategically. We saw that with Freeland calling for nuclear protections against American invasion. We see it with Trudeau being the only country so far to remit seized Russian assets to Ukraine. No other country has done that. It's been conveniently ignored by the media, but it was significant. You're seeing it with the seizure of the leading candidate in Romania, who has been barred from running for re-election. You're seeing activity in Australia, where they're doubling down on enforcing mass migration. This is WEF readjusting for the long haul, and Canada is battleground number one.
I'll be interested to see what happens in the next week or so, and whether Carney actually, I'm assuming he'll call an election, because obviously he's got installed, but he hasn't been elected yet. I'm assuming that they'll have an election, and then the Canadian public will get their chance to see whether we actually want complete globalists running our country, or, not that I have complete faith in Poilievre, but he'll be better than what Carney is for sure. And see where that leads us, and whether we can get back on the right track in this country.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the whole process just kind of underlines just how distant our democracy is from the people themselves. Like, the whole system is set up to basically keep us at arm's length. I mean, you have a guy being installed with 131,000 votes, and he's now the prime minister for the entire country. And I mean, he might call an election, but he could theoretically hold it off until the end of this year. And if he manages to pull some kind of emergency stunt in our constitution, he could literally pull it out, hold off an election until the fall of next year. And I mean, that's just the way our system is structured. It's exactly the opposite of the way the Americans are structured, where there's always some kind of feedback from the people and a way to hold people accountable. In ours, we just don't, and this is the perfect example.
Well, this is what I've been wondering about. Like, the signals point to an April, early May election, right? There's different things talked about last night, from flight logs showing that, and space rentals going on, and different things that happen that are around when elections being targeted. I also think, well, somebody's being a keener, because how the heck would they know what's going to happen in the Liberal Party? Because I'm like, everything to this point has not played out the way it should have. I remember when I had Tom Korski on, and Tom Korski said the only time all these things start happening, he was talking about job positions being people getting positions. He said when they're running like this or heading for an election, that was the fall of 2024. And I mean, now look at where we are, and so many things have changed. Julius has brought it up. Do you think he's calling for an election? I know we're speculating, because how can we possibly know? Dust, you'd mentioned yesterday that, and actually I should say several of you mentioned the other day that essentially his popularity is only going to fall if he stays in. You play out Julius's thought, but I'm like, do they care? Do they care at all about the popularity of it? They have power right now, and if they firmly believe they're going to lose it, then they might as well just hold on to it for as long as possible.
My guess is, from what the little I know, is that Carney has to declare his financial conflicts of interest within 3 or 4 months. So my guess is they'll try to have an election before that time frame. They're also going to try to squeak it in before the Epstein list is finally released and we find out just what was going on there.
I think they have to, if you look at it, because right now they have the prime opportunity with Trump putting tariffs on Canada, where they have an outside bogeyman that they can run against, because they don't want to run on their record, and they really don't want to battle with Poilievre. What they really want to do is battle against Trump, because that's the one that is easiest to vilify. And if they're going to try and win an election, that is the easiest way to do it. So I think they're looking at right now being the best time, because I don't think I think it plays out badly in the media and the population if Carney stays in and pushes the election off, essentially, when he hasn't been voted in yet. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the weird things about the way our system is structured, is that he can call an election whenever he feels like. So he can basically watch the polls and get a sense of where things are at. If the polls are rising, he can hold off. If it looks like they're plateauing, he can call it today. Like, I mean, it's a kind of a joke that that our system allows that sort of thing. Like there should be an actual schedule that it has to happen on, so that you can't game the system to call an election whenever it's most favorable to the prime minister that's currently sitting. I mean, I think that to me is the crux of our system, that we can't that they can play those kinds of games. To me, that's not democracy.
Our system has 3 checks and balances. It's got the Senate, it's got the Governor General, and it has the judiciary. Yeah. All 3 are completely filled now with Liberal Party members who've proven their loyalty over decades. Yeah. So all 3 Canadian checks and balances have now failed. So yeah, we're all agreeing that probably an election in the next 4 months, but we also have to consider there is a worst case scenario where martial law is declared under some sort of contrived emergency, and they just don't go to election with the intent of fomenting an American incursion in order to get rid of Trump or to limit U.S. influence worldwide. We have to consider that option as well.
Yeah, I mean, every time there's some country around the world that pulls some stunt, all the others copycat it, right? I mean, Zelensky pulled this in the Ukraine, that they suspended elections for an emergency, and the world still thinks that they're saving democracy by doing it. Romania cancels an election, overturns it, and bars somebody from running it, and that's still saving democracy. So, like, to me, it's not even like it's a question of what wouldn't they do in Canada to hold on to power. Like they can just pull from all of these different strategies, and somehow it's already been normalized in the public mind. So if they need to contrive some kind of emergency, I don't see why they wouldn't.
It's terrifying. Yeah, I looked at the Canada 338 map yesterday, and again, Liberals are they have a very efficient vote, and they're concentrated in the 4 biggest cities, and in Newfoundland and the eastern provinces. They have to push a few more seats in suburban Toronto and Vancouver, and they're set up for another government.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing that I've thought about too is, how in Germany they built the firewall around the AfD, right? And so even if Poilievre was to manage to get a minority government, theoretically, like, who's he going to build the minority with? If they decide to firewall him, then all of a sudden, even if he's ahead of the Liberals, if the Bloc and the NDP and the Greens decide that they want to gang up with the Liberals and keep him out, then you'd be back with a Liberal or whoever government, and they would push the Conservatives back into the opposition, firewalled right out of existence.
On Saturdays, I help out with the local transfer from grocery store to the community fridge, and I'm loading up the fridge, and there is this over 50s female individual, purple hair, and she's going through the apples. There's one kind of spotty apple, so they give away the whole bag, and they're all, we're stacking them up. She's going through them, separating the Canadian and American apples. She says, "We can't eat American apples. That'd be wrong." And I'm trying to keep my mouth shut. Like, this is a case in point in the mindset, and I'm going to say stupidity, self-centeredness, entitled. You are an older lady. You're going to a community fridge because you cannot afford your own apples. You're not thinking about why, but you're still following the CBC line about apples. And that's the mindset that really terrifies me about this country, how many people are fit into that mindset. And yeah, I think the Liberals have a chance. And the ramifications are not like 4 years of bad governments. The ramifications are police state.
Yeah, very much so.
One of the things I've been toying with, it actually started with you, Julius. Thanks for that, is, this idea of 51st state. I hadn't really given it much thought. Then I had Julius on and spurred on some thoughts, although I think I've come to the firm conclusion that Canada, the 51st state, is a terrible, 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 I can't put enough terribles behind it, idea. But out of that, we've seen, like Jeff Rath now, he's been on the show. He talking about leading a delegation to Washington to go talk about, what would that even look like? And I guess from my standpoint, I'm curious your 3 thoughts on it. Like I look at it and I'm like, any information it would be interesting. Because right now you sit around and you talk about it, but there's really nothing, like, oh, we get the dollar. Oh, we get this. So maybe we get that. But until you actually know anything. You actually don't. And then, I mean, on top of that, it's like, well, then you'd have to have a referendum. So that's why we just had on Ben Trudeau and him talking about the Quebec referendums of the 1990s, not to mention the one in 1980, and just all the things that went on in this country around referendums. It's not just as simple. I think we all knew this, but I'm beginning to explore just how difficult an idea this is. When you look at Carney being a leader and you look at some of the dark days of what this could be, then you come back to, okay, what are possible solutions? All right. How do we get out of this? Because obviously, as Peter so eloquently pointed out, the three things that are supposed to stop some pretty crappy stuff going on are all compromised. So you look at a province leaving and you go, would that do things that could alter the course for Canada? Your three thoughts.
I think it's a leverage point. Alberta needs to be talking about having a referendum on independence to make the headlines over in the East, because they are not hearing us. Number two, we should be supporting crime investigations however we can, like Leslie Lewis has alluded to it. Should we be looking into Trudeau family ownership in the pipelines in the East that import Saudi oil? And is that part of the way that why Trudeau is fighting against climate change, or supposed climate change? Just undermine the Liberals where they're at, which is corruption. The Conservatives are still fighting the Liberals on the basis of policy. I'm like, this is not a policy election. This is a corruption and avoiding a totalitarian state election. And not even the Conservatives are getting it. They're still playing soft, trying to win over the middle-aged purple-haired ladies, which isn't going to happen, right? Number three, I know it's self-serving because I've put so much pro bono time into building understanding and knowledge of corridors and railways and such. There's only so much I can say because there's a lot going on behind the scenes at high levels. But I can say comfortably, the folks at the state and local level, and some degree at the federal level in the States, are very interested in a corridor to Alaska through Alberta. That gives us a leverage point. If we are talking aggressively with them and we're talking about where is it going to go and working at the legal machinations and the corporate governance, that gives us a leverage point, because that gives us more trade routes. It gives us leverage with both Washington and Ottawa. And number four, it might be a little controversial, but I think we need to start talking to people in Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia, rural parts of those provinces, saying you don't have to be colonized by your major cities anymore. Kootenays, you can become your own province quite easily. North Peace, you can become a province quite easily with your resource base, and you have the population to do it. Prince Edward Island is like tiny, and it has 100,000 people or 140,000 people. We can match that. Northern Ontario, Northern Quebec. Why are you beholden to Montreal and Toronto? Separate these guys out so you cut off the tax flow into the four big cities, which suck on the teat of the rural areas, which allow these socialist ideologies to flourish in these big cities because they are in such a strongly subsidized position. Once you take away subsidization and force people to face the real world, socialism dies. And I know that sounds very weird, but you know what? Why not?
Go ahead, Dustin.
Well, Peter's talking about actually fixing Canada, and I think I already know where Julius is going to go with this, but fixing Canada is the biggest problem. To me, it really comes down to the next election. Well, one of two things. If Carney pushes off the next election, that's a red flag right away, because he has not been elected. And the separatist movement of Alberta should happen immediately. If there is an election and Carney gets elected, to me that is the point of no return when it comes to Canada. And at that point, you have to look at Alberta's the easiest one to begin this process, because I do not believe that Canada as a whole could have a referendum on joining the U.S. That'll never happen. So then you look at piecemeal and where it could actually happen. And that's where Alberta comes in. I was always a fan of Alberta becoming its own country, but I realize now where we are in the world that that'd be, let's say, impossible. Because if you ever had a referendum for Alberta to separate from Canada, Canada would drag its feet and make the process as long and as painful as possible, to where it may never happen, essentially, because they do not want to lose Alberta, even though they fight us tooth and nail and everything. When it comes to corridors, Ottawa does not want important corridors from the States going up through Alberta into Alaska. Now, it would be great. It would make a ton of sense. It would also make a ton of sense to have east-west corridors, but this is where it comes down to the government in power. And even if Poilievre comes in, with the rest of the checks and balances being owned by the Liberals, can any of that stuff actually get done? So I come back to, if Carney actually gets elected in the next election, which I assume is going to happen fairly soon, but even if he pushes it off, at that point, Alberta has to look at a referendum itself, because it's the easiest mechanism to actually make change in this country. And then it's like, well, do we actually want to convince Canada to, give a little on what we want? Or the thing about it is if you have a referendum to separate and join the states as the 51st state, which the states would love, because Alberta is a real jewel that they would love. If Alberta ever voted in favor of that, at that point, the U.S. steps in and starts protecting what is theirs. And the process actually gets finished, because the states has a vested interest at that point, and they're the most powerful country in the world.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. I mean, the to be able to try to reform Canada, to me, is a lost cause. I mean, look at Harper. He spent 10 years trying to reform the Senate because, coming from the West, he understood how important that was, and he got absolutely nowhere. Like, he eventually quit, right? So this is where, and that's a small change compared to what actually has to happen to fix this country. Because even if you get Poilievre in, you're only one election away from the next Trudeau, right? Like, that's the thing, is that until the actual structure of this country is changed, you're constantly just gambling with the next one coming in. I mean, this is the same issue that I have with any individual province staying independent. Like, I think that the separatist referendum is the way to go about it. But at that point, do you stay independent or do you join the United States? Well, if you stay independent, what happens if you've got the next Notley government or Neshi, I guess now, with the NDP, that manages to get a hold of the province, right? Like, then you're basically stuck in a dictatorship and you've got nowhere to go. This is where being a province in a large decentralized republic makes more sense as far as maintaining your freedoms. That there's an exit valve and a certain degree of just through the sheer mass of the country, that you have a chance to prevent any individual corner of it going completely crazy overnight, right?
A lot of Canadians
Yeah.
would say you're only one election away from having Biden or Kamala Harris.
Well, see, that's where I like, for sure that is the risk. Part of you still have a lot more protections under the U.S. Constitution than you do under any Canadian Constitution. But I mean, to me, this is where the opportunity of the lifetime is to say, all right, if you lean into the idea of the 51st state and actually organize some reforms on the way in, like repealing the 17th Amendment and trying to pull apart this whole idea of that the states have to be fixed in their current size, like split out the cities as their own mini city states. I mean, Germany's already done that with Hamburg, Bremen, and Berlin. Like, the municipal boundary and the state boundary is one and the same. So if you pull that, you all of a sudden start to decentralize that republic in a massive way. And I mean, in my last piece, I put out a few other suggestions too. Like, this is where down the road, if the republic, or if America stays independent from Alberta, Quebec, whoever, but they carry on their current course, if that republic is not decentralized, it might be 1, 2, 3, 4 administrations from now, and you might suddenly get an invasion under the next Biden president. So you're not any further ahead unless you use this opportunity to actually, bring the republic back towards its own roots and away from this imperial power.
Yeah, Julius, can you talk a bit more about the 17th Amendment? Because a lot of our viewers won't know what that is.
Okay, so the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913 by Woodrow Wilson, and the main goal of that.
Terrible president.
Yeah.
Basically caused World War World War II.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, he passed it with the specific goal of removing this obstacle towards the big, expansion of federal power. And so the 17th Amendment changed the structure of the Senate in the United States. So originally, like the founding fathers set up the Senate so that there was 2 senators per state, but they were appointed by state legislatures, right? So you think of that. So the senator essentially served almost like an ambassador in Washington, and the state could actually fire those senators if they wanted to. So the main goal of that is that the House of Representatives was the voice of the people in Congress, and the senator was the voice of state legislatures in Congress. So what that allowed them to do is that every time there was a piece of legislation, the state legislature could essentially block that if it was starting to eat away at the powers of the states, like growing the federal government at the expense of the states. And so once they removed that limit and basically turned the Senate into another version of the House of Representatives, which are just directly elected, the states lost their voice to block that legislation. So that's all of a sudden where you get the power to, for the federal government to raise its own income taxes to start funding all these institutions, and for the presidency to start basically acting almost like an imperial power at the center of the republic, rather than being on a leash held by the states, where the states could block anything that they didn't want them to do. So that repealing that basically takes it back to a scenario where each state, or if the province is joined, that you have a way in Washington to block that expansion of power without having to rely on the courts, which are appointed by the federal level of government.
So you actually see, sorry, gents, this is the first time I've heard this. So you actually see this as this isn't just a huge opportunity for let's say Canada to redefine what Canada is. You see this as a huge opportunity for, if you're looking at the United States in the same way we look at Canada. Like listen, folks, you know this. I wasn't in this for the last 20 years. So at times I'm just looking at this with new eyes. I'm just like, this doesn't make any sense. Like we're going to spend decades trying to get what we want, or to get some resemblance of normalcy. And Julius just pointed out with Harper, he tried and failed over the course of a decade. He couldn't get anywhere. He almost threw his hands up, right? If you're in the United States, you're probably thinking the same thing about your own country. And what you're starting to point to is there would be a real vested interest in Alberta. Let's pick on Alberta for a sec. The reason why is because it is the crown jewel. I mean, just look at all the resources, not to mention it would fit nicely as a Republican state, right? Like, I mean, like we are a pretty raucous crowd here. Henceforth, this conversation.
You'd be the wealthiest state in the union, apparently.
If you look at it, just to finish the thought, and I'll let you boys hop in, what you're saying is they would have an opportunity to bring in a new state and then redefine what the United States of America is, as much as Canada would be looking to leverage that to get out of some of like the red tape and the rules and the corruption that is plaguing us across this country. Dust, you were going to hop in.
I was just going to say, even if they don't reform the Senate by repealing the 17th, their Senate still functions 100 times better than ours, because our senators are appointed by the federal government. And so they have there's no check and balance there. And to actually reform the Senate in Canada is pretty much impossible, because none of the provinces that control the Senate with all the seats they have are ever going to vote in favor of losing that power. The challenge we have in Canada is the way it was set up was top down, so that the East could control the rest of the country, which it does and will in perpetuity. Whereas in the States, the Senate is actually a check and balance. Now, we better if the states actually, the senators were actually from the state legislature as opposed to being directly elected, but it's still 10 times better than we got in Canada.
Yes and no. Our Senate actually functioned at the point of highest importance is when the Prime Minister tried to renew the Emergencies Act. The Senate stopped him. The Senate said, no, you do not need the Emergencies Act. We're not going to do it. And he pulled back from that point because he did not. The Prime Minister doesn't directly control the senators. Even most of them are Liberals. So that they did actually function when things through. Would it function again with all these new appointees? Probably not. And that's a point of terrifying. But I do think if Alberta puts itself into a position where we're actively negotiating with Washington to become a 51st state, and we put on the table such things as we want our senators to be appointed by the government without the 17th Amendment, preferably across the entire country. that would solidify freedom in the United States enough to make it that I would be interested. Second, the United States needs to get active on what they call red state secession, which is splitting states where, that don't have that urban core, like Oregon, Washington, New York, California, where all the cities vote Democrat, but the rest of the state does not. So it's basically another colonization situation where you have these oversized states. If we're in that active negotiation stage, that gives us the kind of leverage we need with Ottawa to keep ourselves safe.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing I'd point out is that through Doge and with Elon Musk, they are trying to trim back all of this corruption and knock back all of these federal agencies. I mean, Elon has been pointing out that there's been 2 new agencies per year on average for the last century or something, right? But the trouble for them is that they can root all this stuff out, but the current mood is going to eventually change, and new problems are going to show up on the table, and all of a sudden the momentum to start regrowing all of these agencies is going to be right back, right? So at best this is a temporary change of course, but over the long term, how do you keep all this stuff from coming back unless you do something like repealing the 17th Amendment, which kind of pits the state power against the federal power to start undermining the regrowth of these agencies. So because it doesn't matter what rule you pass, somebody's going to find a way around it. Unless, this is the genius of what the founding fathers built, is that you have these 2 separate self-interested entities, the states versus the federal government, that are basically stuck in gridlock, each defending their own interest, and that's what kept the either side from overwhelming the other. That created this decentralized republic where it stops the tyranny at the state level, but it also stops the tyranny at the federal level. And I think that to me is the opportunity here is to resurrect that as a way of cementing what Trump is doing into a permanency by reestablishing that push-pull between those 2 forces.
One caution I need to put on the whole idea of Alberta becoming losing its access to the crown is that Alberta is 100% treaty land, and those treaties are signed with the crown. If Alberta is not under the crown anymore, all those treaties legally need to be renegotiated, and the First Nations their demands are going to be very significant if those treaties are reopened.
Before we move on from this, I need to talk about the 17th Amendment again, because one of the things that I'm not getting through my thick skull this morning is I got Peter sitting there, and Peter's like, I'm not ready to leave Canada. I'm not doing it. Sorry, that's a terrible Peter accent. and then I just heard, actually, if they redid the 17th Amendment, got rid of it, I'd be interested in that. I'm like, okay. When I read the 17th Amendment, and forgive me if I'm missing something here, but I'm just going to read what I pulled up, and forgive me, folks, Wikipedia this morning. But it says, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. The electors in each state shall have the qualification requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. When vacancy happens in the representation of any state in the Senate, the executive authority of such state shall issue writs of election to fill such vacancies, provided that the legislature of any state may empower the executive thereof to make temporary appointments until the people fill the vacancies by election as the legislature may direct. The amendment shall not be so construed as to affect the election or term of any senator chosen before it becomes valid as a part of the Constitution. I hope somebody caught that in there right. I'm like, okay, so why is the 17th Amendment irritating? 2 of you for sure. I can't remember, Dust, you may have said you're against 17th Amendment too. I'm like, what is the 17th Amendment got to do with everything? Put it into simple terms for me, because my skull is thick this morning, obviously, and I can't grasp what the hell you 2 are talking about.
Because when it's elected, the Senate can be filled with a bunch of wonkies like Mitch McConnell that are just out for their own best interests. If it's appointed by the state legislature, then if the senator is just super popular but is not working in the state's best interest, the legislature will just recall him.
So when you say the state legislature, you're talking, I'm going to try and pull it back to Canadian terms. It would be like Daniel Smith here in Alberta, and the MLAs elect their own 2 senators to go off to Ottawa. They don't elect them; they appoint them. Sorry, I'm gonna get the words right here. And then if they're really irritated, they just go, you know what, you two done, or whatever, one of you done. We're putting somebody new in, and you prefer that over this if Alberta had like elections for those 2 positions, correct?
Yeah, because it's still the people appointing them are still accountable to you at the state legislature, right? Like you've elected Danielle Smith and the entire legislature, but see, this is where take the example of Quebec. Like if Quebec wanted to become a state in the United States, how do they protect their culture, their language, their like everything that makes Quebec? I mean, they're the perfect canary in the coal mine because they're so worried about preserving their independence, their sovereignty within the larger envelope, right? So if you don't have a senator that is appointed by that province, right? The only recourse they have if the federal government starts to eat away at their sovereignty is to go to the courts to say, listen, this is overstepping the federal limits here, and the courts are appointed by the federal government. So chances are they're going to rule against them. Whereas if you have a senator that is on a leash for the state legislature or the provincial legislature, you've basically got a way of controlling the federal government, that they can't do anything that the states aren't willing to allow the government to do. I mean, this was the whole idea of the way that the U.S. Republic was structured, is that it's actually, it started as 13 sovereign colonies, and they created a treaty to create this thin level of government where the federal government is basically a tool controlled by the states to do the things that individual states can't do, like protecting national sovereignty or interstate commerce. And by breaking that relationship, you essentially transferred this huge amount of power into the hands of the federal government, which allows the senators to be either bribed by the federal government or bribed by lobbyists wherever. And all of a sudden, you have no way for the state legislatures to stop that, to defend themselves against that.
I can't beat what Julius said, but this actually gives me an opportunity to clarify what I just said about Woodrow Wilson, because I'm sure I was, when I said what I said about him contributing to World War II, I'm like, somebody's going to take me out of context here. Woodrow Wilson contributed to the creation of World War II in 2 ways. Number one, he led the charge with the Germans in World War I, saying, surrender and you'll be treated fairly. And then during the peace treaty, the Brits and the French went hog wild about the reparations thing. The Germans are 100% responsible for the war. This isn't World War II we're talking about. We're talking about World War I. It was all a mishmash of different imperial systems and blah, blah, blah. And then Woodrow Wilson could totally drop the ball and allowed the peace treaty to proceed as it was. And Woodrow Wilson, during the peace treaty, was not talking to his advisors in Washington whatsoever. And the Treaty of Versailles, which basically created the Weimar Republic, which had, basically owed the equivalent of like 10 times the German GDP to France and all these kinds of things, was directly linked to Woodrow Wilson. So everything Woodrow Wilson did had a really bad effect down the line. When you look at the U.S. Senate today, yeah, you've got your Rand Pauls and guys like that, but more you've got like Elizabeth Warrens and your Mitch McConnells and that slimy guy from California. What's his name? They're in power for so long, 6 years, that they just get these corporate corporate benefits, and they build these power structures. Nancy Pelosi, for example, they become super wealthy. So it just becomes an elitist factory. So is the non-elected Senate system perfect? No, it was that unelected system that, we had the U.S. Civil War, but I'm more comfortable with that. And I would be more comfortable with Danielle Smith ordering senators around in either Ottawa or Washington than having 6-year senators or lifetime senators.
Well, in the Senate setup where, like in Canada, the senators from Alberta, even if the provinces sent them, there's too many on Ontario and Quebec that hold the balance of power that the rest of the senators really don't matter. So, whereas in the States, it's
equal representation.
Yes. And so there's
roughly.
actually a balance of power there between the more populated states and the less populated states.
The other thing that is interesting about having a state-appointed Senate is that, like, as it sits right now, there's 100 senators and they're all in Washington. So, whether it's the government that wants to bribe, like the federal government that wants to bribe a senator, or whether the some corporate lobbyists or military industrial complex, whatever, if they want to bribe a senator, there's literally only 100 guys and you have to set up shop in one town to do it. Whereas the moment you switch to a state-appointed Senate, the only way that you can, bribe the senator and get away with it without that senator losing his job is actually to bribe the legislators in each individual state in order to get them to appoint somebody that's corrupt, right? So all of a sudden you have 50 plus states that you have to set up shop in, with 148 legislators on average in each state. So that's over 7,000 people that you have to draw from to be able to figure out how to stack the Senate to do what you want to do. It cuts down the corruption at the federal level in a massive way.
Balances the power between the states and the federal government as well.
Yeah.
Without a doubt.
Well,
So by having these discussions, we build up leverage because we're defining an option for Alberta to leave the country or to negotiate for trade corridors or things like that. So that's the power of this conversation, is we're building up how can Alberta force the East to protect our personal rights and freedoms and eliminate these economic colonialism that we're under. And they're not willingly. You have to use force, and we're talking about the options.
Don't you think, Peter, or Peter, Julius, Dustin, like, maybe I'm wrong on this. I look at this and I go, the reason we start off with Carney is because, like, it's just one more domino that we were waiting to see fall, that everybody could see was going to fall. And then the idea of Alberta, the 51st state, I think just went up a notch. I don't know how big of a notch. It just went up just a little bit, because now you have King Carney, whatever you want to call him, as the leader, the protectorate of Canada now. And I look at that and I go, I have a hard time almost getting my head around the fact that it's happened, but it has happened. Okay. So it's just one domino. Now, it hasn't gone, I think in certain circles, the conversation we're having, the 51st state, I mean, Jeff Rath, once again, leading a delegation down, the fact that these conversations are starting to pick up, where everybody's looking at, okay, what is the next domino? Well, I would say Carney gets coronated roughly around March 24th, if memory serves me correct. That's when Parliament convenes again, and he'd have to be sworn in. And we're going to find out at the end of March here, which, I mean, is once again a couple of weeks away, unless he dissolves and comes back before then. You're going to find out which way this thing is really heading. And everybody's leaning towards we're having an election, which means then we wait a little bit longer. We wait till April or beginning of May or what have you on whether or not the next domino falls. Because I look at this and I go, if Pierre Poilievre gets in, and maybe you three will disagree with me, in the short term, a lot of this conversation dies away. I think a lot of the public just goes, you know what? We got a conservative government and things are going to get better. And in the short term, if he axes the tax and a couple other of his slogans, on the surface, things get better for the short term. Or what are your three thoughts as you look at this?
Alberta actually has a mechanism for a referendum. So I look at that, and you're right. If this is why I go back to Carney and the election, is if Poilievre wins, the Alberta public, the sentiment, the will for a referendum and separation will die down, just because whether I think Poilievre will do better or not, well, I think he'll do better for sure, but whether he'll actually solve the issues and progress things along in the right direction, that remains to be seen. But I think the Alberta public as a whole will calm down and go, it's a conservative prime minister.
Does anyone, sorry, Dust, does anyone on this call go, Pierre can get in, he can make things better, but can he really do the things we're talking about? The answer is no, because everything is corrupted to a point. All it does, Pierre getting in, is it calms the Canadian public down. Wet blanket on a little bit of a simmer. boop,
but
it
if
goes
you're
down.
but if you're going to have a referendum, one, you need the support to have the referendum in the first place, and then you need the referendum to be at least close or to win the referendum. And the only way that happens, like that's not happening if Polyev gets in. The only way that happens is if Carney either tries to retain power without an election or Carney wins the election, in which case then the public in Alberta becomes outraged and you actually have a shot.
Go ahead, Peter.
Going a bit off topic, I view Carney as a Stalin in waiting. I am terrified of the man. It is possible one of his intents is to foment Trump to do something stupid, like an incursion. So I could see him arresting people like us and putting them in prison. Then Trump gets really angry and then does a military incursion so that the WEF can go, look, Trump is the evil imperialist, and try to win against that. I don't put that above what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a world empire that just lost its queen, and it's still very much on the board. And they want to get pawns up to the back of the board so they can get more queens. I look at Ruby Dalla, who was second to win. She was for the Liberal Party. She was knocked out for some mysterious reason, over $50 or something. The Liberal Party kept her $350,000 donation. You know, we're not dealing with people that are playing according to the rules, and we're still thinking in terms of the rules. It's a very dangerous situation.
Well, I listen. The one thing I always point out with the Liberals, the Conservatives do the same bloody thing, right? Mm-hmm. So, full stop here on the Liberal, right? Okay, the Liberals are playing shady, but the longer I look at politics, this is just the way the game's being played. So the Conservatives had their group of people, but I mean, Grant Abraham literally was just on the show talking about when he ran, and they moved him. I mean, you go Joseph Bourgault was another one, and it's on. Is it on? It's all on technicalities. They never give the money back. They never have to be like, oh, this is why. You go to a local, a more local level or a provincial level, and you look at people like Kalen Ford, who would be a slam dunk politician, removed. You know, like here in Alberta, they just had the MLA from, what was it, Slave Lake, folks? I think it's Slave Lake. Didn't vote in favor of the provincial budget, which is a deficit here in Alberta, removed. You go, so we stare at the Liberals, and when your team blew, you look at the Liberals and what they're doing, and you go, oh, look, they're not playing by the rules. But one thing I want to point out to myself, to you three, to the audience, is the Conservatives are just as freaking bad. This whole game is built off of how can we win? That's it. We're just going to win. Don't care because if it was on who is the best politician, there'd be a lot of politicians probably on both sides that would be in. Except that isn't what this is about. Ruby Dahlia was like, I mean, I certainly enjoyed what she was saying. Boom, gone. And would she have won? I don't know. Right? Like maybe. But I think they didn't want that conversation. Yeah, well, they didn't want the conversation on their platform, just like the Liberal or the Conservatives didn't want the Grant Abraham, the Brown from Ontario, and of course Joseph Bourgault out of Saskatchewan. Those three men would they have won? I had a hard time believing that back when Pierre was at the height of where he was at, but they would have added things into the conversation that they just didn't want there. So what they do? They found a way to remove them on technicalities. Both parties do it. Both major parties do it. Probably all the parties in the political system do it. It's just part of this game. It's a very nefarious game. It's dark. You don't like I look at the NHL. I always bring things back to the hockey world, and people will laugh at me. But the Vegas Golden Knights come in, and they're given all these favorable rules. Are the next teams that come in given those rules? No, they're going to change them a little bit. And then they have Stone, and everybody will remember Stone. They put him on long-term injury reserve. Oh, but he's ready to go by playoffs. Everybody can see it's all about winning. And so that's my rant for you. Carry on.
Yeah, I mean, part of when I look at Carney, I think Peter's right on the money as to the danger there, and yet the irony is that the other side with Poilievre is that he diffuses the tension, and yet he's because there's this expectation that he's going to save things, and at the same time he's more likely to end up like a Boris Johnson or a Rishi Sunak from the UK that comes in and pushes the same globalist nonsense, right? Like this, we've seen this over and over in every single country. And I think this is where I think there's a huge difference in the conservative idea that's now emerged under Trump versus the conservatism of most conservative parties. Is that most conservative parties are conserving the post World War II era. All of the ideas, the institutions, the core philosophies of when there's a problem, Poilievre wants free trade with China to replace free trade with America. Let's build the pipelines, right? Whereas Trump is actually taking all of these, post World War II pillars and attacking them. It's like, well, free trade has hollowed out America. We need tariffs to bring the manufacturing back. Like, it's philosophically 180 degrees away from the approach that Poilievre or any of the other conservative leaders in other countries have taken towards solving the problems that are now in our era. Like, it's like the ideas that solved the problems of the Second World War, of free trade and alliances and all that. Those things have now been weaponized into problems that are destroying our countries. The solutions to one era become the problems of the next. And I think this is the core of why, whether Poilievre is pro World Economic Forum or against it, in some ways it's like, well, he's still actually defending the same core pillars that the globalists are now leveraging to turn into a global empire. So even if he isn't part of that empire, he's still preserving their tools, whereas Trump is attacking their tools. And I think that's the core philosophy difference between the two.
The big mindset difference is still believing in the institutions versus not believing in the institutions.
Yeah.
And this is, you're right about the concern about Poilievre. Is he going to trust the institutions that are in place that I think for a lot of people post-COVID, I don't trust the institutions anymore because they've proven to be corrupt. And what Trump is doing is attacking those institutions and taking things back to the base essentially, and rebuilding, or trying to rebuild something that makes sense for this era. And as long as you're just like fiddling around the edges, you're actually not doing anything, and you're living within their frame or their world essentially. Like net zero, Poilievre hasn't come out against it. So that, is he going to do anything too radical? Probably not. He might get rid of the carbon tax, but is he going to actually go against net zero and climate change narrative? And to this point, he hasn't, essentially. So,
well, it's like most of the conservatives are preserving the era that was created by Woodrow Wilson of this liberal international order. Whereas Trump is actually harking back to the conservatism of President McKinley, which is, the pre-Woodrow Wilson era, which was, controlled by tariffs and had a very different, much smaller footprint as far as, trying to do social engineering. So I think there's the philosophical split between the two sides.
Do we dare bring up the topic of fiat currency?
Sure.
I'm game. Go for it.
Fiat, okay, gold. Under traditional systems, the bank would have gold in their vault, and then they would issue receipts for the gold to people who owned it. And then the bank realized that most people keep their gold in the bank most of the time, so the bank can issue more receipts for the gold than the bank actually has in gold. So the bank, that's where the whole 10-to-1 ratio, the bank could lend out 10 times as much money as it had in its vault, because most people keep their gold in the vault and pay a fee for it. And that went on for a long time. So the banks are doing very, very well. And then they said, why do we even need to have the gold? People just use the paper. And that's where you had the development of the Federal Reserve and, the private banks like the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, which aren't, you think they're multi-year, that they're, immutable organizations. But no, they're not that old. And the whole idea of a currency issued by a government that's backed by nothing really took off in the 1970s. And I'm not an expert in this topic, but it certainly seems interesting because a lot of these kinds of issues and globalization issues and the global elite really seem to really take off once you eliminated the gold standard. What do you guys think?
I mean, from the time that Woodrow Wilson created the Federal Reserve, which was part of this, moving towards the Keynesian economics, the paper money, the value, like the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar has devalued by 98% since 1913. Right? Like we have utterly destroyed wealth on a colossal scale as a consequence of creating the Federal Reserve System and moving away from the gold standard. And I mean, there's different chapters that there's, the first steps were taken in the late 1800s, and it basically finished under Nixon, and actually seizing gold out of people's holdings, right? But that process utterly gutted the United States and all other countries that played on the same, by the same rules. I mean, Canada is in the same boat.
Yeah. Another way to view it visually is back in 1913 or whatever, you could buy a Ford T model, whatever it was, for about a stick of gold. Okay, it'd be worth $35 or something. Yeah. Nowadays, a half decent car is $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, which is a stick of gold. So gold has not lost its value. The cash has lost its value.
Yeah. I agree with most of that, but every time I listen to Martin Armstrong, I get confused. And I'm going to lay out his basic argument, and I'm not going to do it justice. But he goes, if you look back across governments over time, if you have gold coins with the same amount of gold in them in two different currencies or two different countries, the country that is more powerful, the gold coin will be worth more, even though the gold content is the same. And so, I understand the risk of fiat currencies. Obviously, governments printing insane amounts of money and inflation going through the roof. But I understand Martin's point in that because you have gold, it doesn't matter if they're the same size, the same weight. The country, the U.S. gold coin versus the Canadian gold coin, the U.S. gold coin is going to be worth more just because the trust in government or the trust in the power of the government will make it so that the American gold coin at this point in time would be worth more. Now you go out 50 years and the U.S. isn't the most powerful country anymore. All of a sudden the Chinese gold coin would be worth more. But it's not like it's just the gold content that determines the value of the coin.
He was talking, he always talks about Caesar being on the gold coin, right? Mm-hmm. And what that represented back in that era. It was trust and that it represented what it actually represented.
Yes. Anyhow, so I don't know. I can't articulate or I don't fully understand the argument fully yet, but just relying on a system where you say, well, we have this much gold, therefore we have, it's more complicated than that, I believe.
The idea of having a gold standard is that you can't print money that you don't have gold for. Like if every dollar that's in circulation is tied to a certain amount of gold sitting in a bank vault, it puts a lid on the government inflating away your currency, right? Yeah. And so by breaking that link, you've unleashed this incredible spending binge that's run on debt and printed money that the government can get away with because who's counting how many dollars are being printed? Whereas, as soon as there's a gold standard, every bank is looking to make sure that, there's actually gold equivalent to every dollar that they take in. So there's a sort of a self-regulating process that's in place. And I think this is, maybe there's other ways to rein in that kind of spending, but I think that the gold standard is, or some kind of commodity-based standard like that, is an extremely important part of bringing our governments back into a balanced financial situation.
Well, and inflation has been a massive issue over the last couple of years as governments printed obscene amounts of money coming out of COVID for sure.
Well, and the irony is that the main reason that they do this is to fund wars. So, there's a lot of people that are concerned about joining the United States because of the United States history of military adventurism. Well, one of the ways to bring that back into some kind of balance is to take away their ability to fund endless wars, and one of that is through the gold standard.
A really crazy idea is to go back to the Old Testament where it calls for Jubilee, which has never been implemented, which was every 70 years, all debts are canceled. And I'm like, boy, that would actually be a big reset button every 70 years, because around year 50 or year 45, all the financial institutions and lenders would start really restricting how much they lend because they want to be paid back, right? so that some people are good with money, some people are bad with money, but it just creates a giant reset button. It also, these multi-generational debts like Trudeau's created would be a way to bring an end to them. So I was like, what would happen if in the year 2090, Canada declared a Jubilee, or the West declared there'll be Jubilee? I was like, I actually could see this working. That's my crazy idea. My crazy idea of the day.
Well, I mean, we're talking about Alberta 50. I mean, we're talking about a bunch of crazy ideas today. Alberta 51st state. I remember when I had Martin Armstrong on the first time, and he said he doesn't see Socrates doesn't see Canada as a country by 2030. Like it'll be, and he argued. He was discussing even the United States. I was like, how on earth would that be possible? And then he said it could be just something small, right? Like that sets it off that you can't even predict that it's coming. And I look at this conversation today, and we're talking about crazy ideas. One, because Mark Carney is now the Prime Minister of Canada, right? And you go, okay, well, then there's a whole lot of unknowns. And if certain events play out, then certain events are certainly going to be a reaction to those events, right? Like there's just a whole lot going on here. So crazy ideas, like forgiving everyone's debt after every 7 years. That is a crazy idea. I would think the powers that be don't like that idea one iota.
I've been playing with crazy ideas on for the whole 51st state thing. And I mean, the other question that comes up for any province that wants to join the United States is, what if the marriage is sour and you want to leave again, right? Like, can you leave? And I mean, the U.S. Civil War pretty much closed that door, that once you're in, there's no leaving. And there's good reasons for that, which is that, if you split into two parts like they did in the Civil War, you have, the entire continent going to war. And if you try to split out again, you're going to be, chewed up on the outside by other foreign powers that want to have a piece of you. But at the same time, once you're in and you end up with the federal government growing more and more powerful, you end up under an authoritarian dictatorship, and there's no way back out without, a war. So leaving kind of becomes a necessity then. And so, to me, the balance that could be struck is that you actually use so that if you come in, as long as the republic stays decentralized, that most of the power is held at the state level, that there's no exit door. But if the power starts to shift towards the federal government, where you can possibly end up under a tyranny, that certain triggers can be hit, and there is an actual exit door built into the Constitution, right? And you could use something like, federal spending as a percentage of GDP, or federal debt as a percentage of GDP, or both, as triggers to open that exit door. So that if an Alberta or a Quebec that is very concerned about maintaining its sovereignty on its home soil joins the Republic, that you're in as long as you have and there's no exit as long as you have that high degree of sovereignty at home. But the moment that the Republic is kind of replaced by a big empire, all of a sudden that door opens that you can leave again. And to me, that would be another way to sort of incentivize the system to not get more federally centralized.
Ironically, that's why the Soviet Union dissolved in the 1989 or 1991, whatever it was, because in their constitution, every republic had the right to self-determination and independence. So when Russia just declared independence, the Soviet Union just automatically dissolved. And there wasn't an immediate civil war. Where you've seen wars in the post-Soviet Union is where the boundary was really badly drawn, which was between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and with Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, which kept going fine until, which is a whole other topic. The Americans got involved in 2014. So yeah, we're playing with some big ideas that need a lot of fleshing out. But I think the main theme we're coming at is that we need to be thinking out of our comfort zone, because we're not dealing with the Prime Minister of Canada, who's maybe a bit of a dick, excuse my French. We're dealing with a world empire that has shown itself to be brutal in every way possible, up to and including bloodshed.
Well, the thing about, Alberta independence versus Alberta joining the States is that joining the States would actually stop a civil war from occurring, essentially. Because there's a risk that if Alberta tried to go independence and push the issue with the federal government, that the federal government, would essentially arrest everybody and a civil war would break out, those kind of things. Whereas if you're joining the States and you vote in favor of joining the States would suddenly immediately protect you from the Canadian government. And there'd obviously be a lot of negotiating, which that's actually the bonus of Trump being in there is you'd have someone who would negotiate well on the state side to actually make things work. So,
but I think what we all agree on is the best case scenario is a Canada that is free of globalist interference, CCP interference, and whatever you believe, whether it's Qatari, Russian, Chinese, Indian, whatever, Khalistani, these influences don't belong here. We need to get rid of those influences to make the country at least work on a day-to-day level. And over the long term, we need to restructure Ottawa, and the stasis and the ossified bureaucracy and the fact that Easterners just don't get it needs a big push. So I think our fundamental, I think we would all agree that Canada that works is our best option, but it's really frustrating that Canadians aren't realizing it because they're living on our money, right? And we need to push the issue because it's the same as with the wife of an abusive spouse. Her primary power is her feet. She can walk out the door. Well, we're the wealthy lady that owns the household that has got a bunch of entitled kids that are squabbling and fighting. That lady saying, "Get out of the house," or "I'm going to leave the house."
I would say we're the big kid that's getting bullied, and we just don't realize our size. Like, we just don't realize when we swat them for the first time, they're gonna be like, "Oh my God, what just happened?" Right? Like, I think we don't understand what we actually have because we've been told for so long that you're, whatever, this, that, and the other. And it was part of the reason with one of the hard things with conservatives is we have a really hard time coming together. We just do. And it's because we have wonderful people that think for themselves. I mean, that's about as simple as it gets. When you get a bunch of headstrong people who think for themselves in a room, everybody's right. And so that's hard to put in a direction. But we're getting to a point here, folks, where you look at Carney being in, everything you've all said about him is 100% bang on. Like, I mean, I went and played hockey last night, walked in, and oh, where were you? I was like, he's talking about new prime minister. Oh yeah, who's that? I'm like, Mark Carney. And typical hockey is, guess we changed our flags from, and you're pardoning your French, I'll pardon my French, fuck Trudeau to fuck Carney. And I'm like, that's as simple as they are. They're just done with the Liberal Party in that room, right? But to the common voter, or maybe even not the common, to the people that are paying attention, I think they realize how dangerous, precarious of a situation we're in with this change of governance and the change of prime minister.
If the only way that you break this is this, I think if some of the provinces start pushing for independence movement, and I mean Quebec is certainly growing, but the most likely group to want to get out is Alberta, plus possibly Saskatchewan and BC, since they're the ones that pay the most into the equalization funds, right? But the demographics are not on our side. Like, this has to happen soon. Otherwise, the continuing growth of these mega cities just makes it more and more hard to get out, because the voters in the mega cities overwhelmingly vote Liberal. They overwhelmingly support the globalist ideas. Like, if this doesn't happen soon, the exit door closes just naturally, just through the sheer speed at which these different cities are growing. I mean, Ottawa is growing, just as an example, because we were living there for a while. Ottawa is growing at the speed of 40,000 people a year. That's the entire population of our town of Vernon every single year is being added. Like, at those rates, all the power just keeps shifting there, just through the way that our MPs are like through the electoral districts. Like, the power shifts to those big cities on such a scale that eventually the referendums to exit are gone. I mean, we've already seen that even in Alberta, where the rural regions are all ready to separate, and the cities are heavy NDP strongholds.
Well, and that's the key to it all. Is it's not actually Ottawa. It's the place that actually might want to get out is Alberta, but the demographics and the immigration into Alberta changes the demographics immensely over time, and it gets worse for actually having a vote and deciding to do something different.
Jen, oh sorry.
Well, I'm going to disagree a bit on that. It's not exactly related. The taxation, financial, and royalty structures are set up to benefit centralized cities. And we talked, you can talk about separating big cities as separate provinces. You can also talk about reforming the royalty and taxation implementation systems so that they're more equitable and less of a drain on the rural areas. And number two is, when I push for corridors, I'm also going Alberta is going to be doubling its population. And right now we're set up that most of that population growth is in our two major cities. And I'm going, why? With more corridors, more infrastructure, you can have more mid-sized cities. And that's another reason I think the UCP should take this issue seriously is why can't Lloydminster double or triple in size? Why can't High Level be 50 or 100,000 people? Why can't Grand Prairie be 300,000 people? It just needs they're at the end of branch lines of infrastructure as opposed to being on transcontinental grids. That's my little geek moment.
Yes, I mean, this is where if you decided in Alberta or in BC that you wanted to split the big cities out, you'd have to get the permission of the big city voters to do it, right? This is how our system is set up. So they probably wouldn't want to do it. But if you were trying to negotiate to become the 51st state, as it sits right now, the current structure would basically tip, bringing the Canadian voters in would tip the electoral college into the hands of the Democratic Party, possibly for generations, because we're so left-leaning. But if you suddenly say, listen, so bringing this whole idea of changing the cities out as their own states, it becomes suddenly of interest to the federal government or to the Trump administration to say, well, we better make sure that we don't wreck the Republic by bringing the Canadians in. So, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Ottawa, and possibly Edmonton and Calgary should all be their own little city states. And we're going to redraw the boundaries so that there's an equal balance of Democrat versus Republican or conservative versus liberal entities. So all of a sudden there's a real push. There's the 800-pound gorilla suddenly wants to make it happen too, and that increases the likelihood of getting it done.
Gentlemen, appreciate you hopping on today.
Thanks for having us.
I highly doubt we solved anything today, but one of the things about these conversations is you're putting in new ideas that very few have wrestled with, and I know there are people that were actively wrestling with them, but I would say there's a whole bunch of the Alberta population and everywhere else in Western Canada tuning into this that hadn't really given it a whole lot of thought. So appreciate you guys coming on and exploring some different ideas today, and hopefully it's not the last time.
Thank you very much.
Definitely. Thanks so much for having us.